Hello, friends. Welcome to the Quaker Stitch, a Quaker podcast by a Quaker couple about anything and everything to do with modern American friends.
We're your co-hosts, Southgate.
And Salazar.
Today we're talking about what is in a meeting.
What's in a meeting? That which by any other name we would call a church.
Basically, Quakers don't call like the gathering that you have every Sunday church. You call it meetings. It's a meeting of people, of friends.
We have meetings for, and then we call organizations meetings because that's what they do. They meet.
Exactly. So then there's like regular churches meeting for worship, and then meeting for business is once a month, and then that's what you would call a monthly meeting of friends. So like those who are like in church together.
I think in order for us to talk about this, we should talk about the specific Quaker context we come from, because even Quakers will tell you like there is all the diversity under the sun for Quakerism, but we still have a culture. So there is some specificity that is required to that.
Exactly. And we're definitely coming from like specific traditions.
We had meeting for worship at the Chelsea Hotel. That time we met at the Chelsea Hotel with Kenan and Carly and some other people. And we had meeting for worship, silent gathered worship. And at the very end, after we concluded the meeting, we were going around the circle talking about like what church meant for us or what was church for. Meeting, what is a religious congregation for? And different people had different answers. I think Hilda's answer was like, oh, like for community, for like being together with like-minded people of like a specific spiritual sense. But for me, I was like right away immediately, I was like, oh, births, marriages, and deaths. That's what it's for. Baptism, marriage, and funeral rites. Like those three things, I was like, well, life is always going to have those. And so you need a community space for those things which life entails.
Exactly. Like that's basically my context for like, yeah, what is church for? It's for a community. That's how the community decides to take care of itself or takes it upon itself to do anything.
And I think also, and I've talked to other Catholic people about this because there is this sort of like feeling or this theologic idea in Catholicism and like classic Catholicism that like if you don't get baptized, your soul can't go to heaven. But that was like never true for me or for the way that my community talked about it. Like the scandal of not baptizing your baby is the scandal of like why would you do that? Like why wouldn't you want to give the baby a public bath where everyone can meet it and know its name and welcome it to life, basically? And so, and I've talked to like Brazilian people about this, I've talked to like Irish people about this, and like they also kind of like agree. Like we all have different levels of like extent to which the adults, especially the religious sort of influences in our life, were hateful towards someone or had these sort of very negative beliefs that you don't get baptized, you can't go to heaven. But for me and for them also, like, that wasn't as strong as just like, yeah, you need to have a party for a baby when you have a baby. Like that just makes sense. And like the scandal of not baptizing your children is like, what are you gonna do? Like there has to be a baptism equivalent. I'm thinking about like in Korean culture where they have when the baby turns a year old, they have the sort of like fashion selection thing where they have the different
Oh
objects.
yeah.
I think they also have that in like some other Asian places. That's a thing, and that feels like the same. Like it feels like that would fulfill the exact same.
Introduce the
Yeah,
baby to God and everybody.
yeah.
Yeah.
And when I talk about like Mexican Catholicism or Mexican folk Catholicism, like all Mexicans are folk, so Mexican Catholicism, which is what I was strongly raised with. Like both my parents are very, very Mexican Catholic, strong agnostic, but they still observe all of the rituals of life. Like they're still they were baptized, they got me baptized, they had their first communion, they made sure I had my first communion, and where I had my first communion was actually in Maine in a New England Catholic church where they also did confirmation at the same time. Which
nice.
I think I talked to my cousin Alina in Las Vegas more recently. They also do that there, I think.
Okay, got you. Yeah, it's really interesting. Like I think, and it's definitely not that like black churches don't have sacraments, but like the, I don't know, enforcement of like you have to get confirmation, you have to do like, what do you all do? Catechism?
Well, if you don't have confirmation, you can't get married. That's the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, first communion is not a sacrament. It's like a religious rite, but it's technically not a sacrament. Baptism, confirmation, marriage, and last rites. Gotcha. And last rites you don't need. Like if you go without your last rites, it's fine as long as you got baptized and were confirmed. I think how the Anabaptists did it, not the Quaker Anabaptists, but like the Anabaptists that still believed in baptizing people when they were grown. I think that would be the equivalent of confirmation, basically.
Okay, gotcha. So a lot of, I don't know, and I have no idea where that one came from, but there are a lot of like the Black religious tradition includes baptism. Like it definitely outside of just the
Well,
Baptist
you also call it something
church.
different. You call it a christening,
Yeah. Well,
or those
so
words for you would be interchangeable even.
yeah, exactly. So like I had a christening. Me and my brother like both had one when I was 4 and he was like new. And then baptism like itself, like that's something I know like people like usually like when they're grown like decide to do at some point. Like, I guess you can
Yeah,
baptize a baby, but like the
yeah.
kind of like
If you converted to Catholicism, you would still have to be baptized, but that would not mean the same thing culturally to me and
mhm,
my community as what it means then. Like the reason you baptize a baby is not to make them Christian. Like it has almost nothing to do with religion other than the church is a place where you do everything in community. You
exactly.
know, like that would be like, oh, okay, so you accepted Jesus in your life when you were older. Sure. Like that would be the equivalent of like, oh, so you basically just like got confirmed or baptized in the spirit, which would equate to confirmation for them. But
Mhm.
that exists in a very different space and also does not bring the kind of shock that like saying like, oh, I'm not baptizing my baby. Like if someone said like, if I told my parents I'm not baptizing my baby, they'd be like, why? Like they first would ask why. Like why would you not do that? That's like me like, oh, I'm gonna raise my baby with no shoes. It's like, why would you be raise your baby with no shoes? I might then say, oh, Quakers have this other thing, or Quakers don't do that. But then they would be like, oh, well, then how do you welcome the member into your community? Like if I
Exactly.
told them that there was an equivalent Quaker way to do a baptism, they would just immediately change it over in their head to that. Like it
Exactly.
would fulfill the exact same needed niche as a quote unquote baptism, which is not theologically at all what's supposed to be. Like that's not supposed to be the theological stakes.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So I had almost the same interaction with one of my coworkers who I love. She was finishing. She's the one that knew my Quaker mentor Jerry,
Mm-hmm.
because she was finishing seminary, and we've been working together for years at this point. And then I was telling her about our wedding because quarantine had happened and this and that, so I hadn't seen her in a while. So I was telling my coworker about our wedding, and she was like, oh, you're Quakers. But then I explained, oh, we still get married under God in a church, da, 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 and she's like, oh, okay, a real wedding. And she was like, oh, okay, it's fine. And clearly she had, I don't know, like it was clearly, oh, never mind, real church, you explained, yes, yes, yes.
The skepticism is then immediately followed by like contextualizing with other people, because other
Exactly.
people also like want, like for the most part I find, want to find an equivalent in their culture to what you do.
Exactly.
Like they are very willing to believe in like true universal, something about culture is universal. And
Hmm.
for me, when we asked that, when we had that meeting and people asked like what's the church for, it was immediate. Like for me it was immediate: birth, marriage, death. Like that was like, well, those are the constants of life, and therefore you need a place that the community can do those constants, because that's the constant that
Exactly.
requires community. And so, yeah, and for me, that was like so immediate. I was like, that's very Catholic of me, but it's not that Catholic. It's very Mexican of me.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel like a lot of my like real like I don't know sensibilities or expectations I guess of like spiritual community are very predicated on like the like black church tradition.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And when we did catechism, and I did my catechism there in Maine, where it was confirmation at the same time. We also we went to synagogue, we went to masjid. Like we went to the other Abrahamic faiths, and I'm sure we would have gone to others if there had been others. But it was kind of like a tour. Like it was very much like, oh, here's where we do religion. Let's do our religious studies, and then other people have other religions. Field trip. And that was it. Like there wasn't a big competition. Like it didn't feel competitive. It didn't feel like, oh, we have to prove we're right, or we have to do this, or we have to do that. It was literally just like, oh, here's religious place for us. There's other religious places. Tour. Okay, that was your religious education with the catechism, right? So
Hmm.
like it was almost a part of that. And other people don't do that.
Yeah.
Like there is a feeling I get from other people that's like, if you acknowledge that other people can do things differently, that's saying that you're wrong for what you're doing. And obviously you're not wrong because you chose to live this way. Like in the very evangelical, sort of like white, non-denominational Christian, but like Christian is the best, and like everyone needs to be a Christian, and like Christmas is for Christians, and the Christmas is Jesus. Like that very like strong feeling of like cultural superiority that
Hmm.
like is attached to Christianity, like just wasn't present for
Yeah.
a lot of the places and like communities I was exposed to, grew up with, formed my religious ideas about. Like it was all about like, oh yeah, like we all everyone wants to talk about God, so you have to have a place to talk about God. That's what a church is, and therefore a church can also include any number of holy spaces.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that was very much the context I observed growing up, even if it's not the context that like all of the adults in my life would have described.
Mm-hmm.
But like definitely like the impression I got was that like yeah, churches where you do community and Jesus and like spiritual problems, because people be having spiritual problems. When you grow up you might have spiritual problems just because like life is hard. Like that was like
Yeah,
the
yeah,
impression
yeah.
of adulthood, of like spiritual adulthood that I got. It was like maybe you'll go to church, maybe you won't, but like the church is the place for like if you are having those particular
Yeah. Yeah,
problems.
it's almost like sports, right?
Yeah.
Like it very much feels like, oh, everyone has sports. The ball might be different, the stick might be different, the tool might be different, the forms and the rules might be different, but like everyone needs a place to go, either with fields or with courts where they can do the sport they do. Like that is very much like the feeling that I had growing up. But also to me it was very funny because like Christians meant not Catholics, which is different than Protestants, which is different than evangelicals. But to me, they
Mm-hmm.
all got wrapped up in the same thing. Even when I'm talking to your mom, like your mom uses the word Christian, and I'm like, well, technically, like you can't be Christian unless, and she's like, what? Like Christian just means good person, right? And so like that classic thing of
Yeah.
like how C.S. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity. Like, in
Mm-hmm.
order for Christianity to have any definition, you can't just say Christian when you mean a good person.
Yeah.
Like, you can defend people for being not terrible people without having to say they are Christian. But that's new. That wasn't true. That was like,
Yeah.
you couldn't be a person if you weren't Christian. Like,
Exactly. Well, also like, and this is where I find a lot of the things I've learned in the recent years, I find the most interesting in context is that the things about black churches that distinct them from other Protestant churches, like mainline Protestant churches, say I don't know, there was some meme that went viral. Mainliners are living a whole other life.
what's mainline?
Mainline Protestant would be like, I don't know, I guess the main Protestant denominations, but like in non-white spaces.
Another thing that I found really interesting, really not interesting, but almost shocking, is I asked you, like, do you guys do communion? Because we went to your church, Methodist church, and I was like, you guys do communion? And you didn't know. And to me, that was really strange because I was like, okay, it's okay. It's like, if you don't have it, that's fine. If you have it, that's fine. If you differ with Catholics about transubstantiation and that whole thing, sure, that's fine. But for you to not know if you do it was very strange. And
Yeah.
I asked your mom too, and she also like, didn't understand the question. And I was like, "Do you got like the reason to go to mass is to have communion, and the reason to get excommunicated, the reason excommunication is bad is because you are barred from having communion ever again,
Hmm.
and that's how God forgives you for your weekly sin."
Yeah, I think the real crux of it is that like with black theology is that like God is with you all the time. So like how could communion make or break something about your faith? Which is
Which is crazy considering the Protestant Revolution.
well, yeah, yeah,
Which just goes
like
to show how
in
like,
hindsight,
yeah,
but like we do communion, we have it once a month at like our United Methodist Church, but it's not like, oh, you didn't do communion and now you're dirty.
yeah. Well,
Like
everyone seemed very confused by my question. Like they didn't, and I kept explaining, and it just kept sounding more. I kept feeling more and more like I was in the fucking Inquisition when I was like describing. It's like, well, if you don't do the communion, you're living in sin extra. But also like Catholic, like the Catholic dogma is that you have to confess your sins before you take communion. But my mom, from the time I was very little, did not believe in that. She was like, no, you just stay in silence. You ask God to forgive you for your sins. Like you have a cool little one-on-one meeting in the pew by yourself with God. And if you feel that you've told all your sins to God internally, then yeah, go have communion. Like that was what I was taught by my mother.
your
Which goes,
mom's a
yeah, no,
Quaker.
she's very Quaker by another name. For sure, for sure, for sure. Yeah, even we were just talking about both our parents hate brand names. Like my mom would cut things off, or like when I cut off like logos and stuff, like she hated that. She's like, why would I want to be a walking advertisement for this
Exactly.
company? Like it was very very Quaker sensibilities that we grew up with in our parents, but that came from like a very strong agnostic attachment to their cultures and the
Yeah.
religious aspects of their cultures. Because
Yeah.
also, if we're talking about Mexican Catholicism, like you have to think about like what we syncretized with to become that, right? The Nahuatl beliefs, like the
Hmm.
Nahuatl way of life, and like the thoughts and the cosmology, like it's all still in there. Like if you take out the Roman Catholicism, it's all still that native religion that is like older than so many other things.
Yeah, no, definitely. My parents were the same way about clothes. I don't know how like deliberately or not, but yeah, they were an interesting match. I think they had a very city mouse country mouse situation going.
My parents too
Yeah, my
kind of
dad's
had the
family
dynamic
is more from so my dad is from Muskegon, Michigan, but his family is from like the south, more toward the
from
Delta,
Mississippi, Missouri.
Mississippi, Missouri, at some point Louisiana, although unclear when. So his family's much more southern in culture and in habit and practice. And then my mom's family is more from upstate New York. Her dad's from Appalachia, sort of like Kentucky towards Cincinnati. Like sort of very different religious contexts.
And different eras in which they either were emancipated or reached freedom or
Oh yeah,
sued for like or class of like different times at which they
exactly. They got papers
got
at
papers.
completely different
Yeah.
times. And by which and got papers, I mean literally had their names written down and had like legal identities in the United States. Because if you weren't emancipated, you didn't have like weren't necessarily on the census.
Yeah.
And like so like as far as like myself as a descendant, like, I can track my mother's family for
Well, yeah.
decades and decades and decades longer than my father's family, because my father's family got free around emancipation, whereas my mother's family got free at various times.
Yeah.
And like lived in the North in like the early 18.
Yeah. Some of your family is
50s.
from the community that Harriet Tubman settled in.
Exactly.
Some of your family is like legally passed into whiteness because they had enough ancestry in that
True.
era,
Yeah,
you know?
there was a cousin that disappeared into I think Toronto, Canada area. Really interesting.
Yeah. And your grandma was part of the Great Migration, like into Chicago, and like you can see like the first records. I've seen them actually, and they're very heartwarming because like the first records of like their names. And there's no last names. You kind of have to know what the family names were because you have to deduce which one is your family from there. But from what your aunt's research, what she did, it's very heartwarming because like you see like they list there whether or not you're literate, and you can see that all the adults that have these like family names, you're like, oh, that's probably my family, these three adults, and then all of the kids are literate, like it says like all the kids know how to read and write, and like
Yeah.
none of the parents do, and that's like that first sort of like census taking and also taking of that information.
Yeah, no, and like I find it, and I feel like as far as education goes, with like within the black communities that I grew up in, like definitely education in the church, like the church being there to facilitate the education of the
Yes.
children,
Yeah, yeah.
is like so deep in there. Because like sure, like rich black people fully, and like everybody has classes, and it's like, oh, let them go without shoes, let them eat cake, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But like for a child to go without like an opportunity for an education, that is like far worse than going
That's
shoeless,
like not a
shirtless,
personal
or like without
responsibility thing.
dinner. Exactly.
That's the
Like that.
limit of personal responsibility, is the children
Exactly.
need to know have their education.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like that really for me is like it, if the community has not is, can't come together to like make sure the children have what they need to go on for, like
Yeah.
later, then what are we even
Yeah.
doing here?
Well, and that also really reminds me of like how much of like Mexican Catholicism is just the Mayan or the Mexica or the Nahua or like whatever sub tribe you had or whatever greater culture, because like
Mm-hmm.
cultures were shared across tribes, right? Like there is
Mm-hmm.
more of a shared culture, shared language than there is specific tribes and communities and groups that would consider themselves a group unto themselves. But in those, like so much, there's a speech that the last leader of the Mexica after the times of contact gave. That's like the very last speech he gave when he was like surrendering. And he basically talks about it's a speech meant for his people to give them hope, even though their rulership is collapsing and they're being conquered, basically. And he talks in that speech about the important, like it's a poem. Their poems were speeches. Their speeches were poems. Their political speeches were always poetry. And he basically names the ball games, our salons of culture, our schools, and our places of worship. I mean, I can look it up later.
Último discurso de Tlatoani Cuauhtémoc al pueblo mexica.
Día secuatle veintena de Tlaxochimaco del año Yeicayi.
But like he names these key aspects of culture, which he then says you have to shut down because we have to be Catholic now. Like we have to take rulership from these people that are now ruling us. And so he's saying like shut it all down. We're going to shut it all down. And then he has this beautiful part where he talks about like, but you have to hold it in your heart and you have to teach your kids the importance of these things, even if they don't have them. I'm sort of like making an analysis of his speech, but like it's very famous. You can look it up. Maybe I'll put it up here. But the point there is that like when you get conquered, when genocide happens to you, cultural genocide happens to you, that there is an encoding you have to do into your rearing of your children that cannot be obvious. Like you can't say it, you can't write it down, you can't tell them that this is why you're doing it, but you have to confer to them the importance of having a baptism for their children in which all the community comes together. And we had a similar thing. Now it's have a similar thing to the Korean thing. And again, I think it exists in other places in Asia too, in Southeast Asia, where you would like bind the children's hands and you would say, you are bound to this community. Like you have to do what's good. You would give them the tools of that would be of their trade. And it was gender segregated because like that's how they split these up. But it was basically just like you're gonna protect your family, you're gonna give to your family, you're gonna sow the corn, you're gonna do this. And it was like that ritual existed before the concept of like quote unquote religious ritual baptism from the Catholics, right? The concept of you have a baby, you have a period of isolation because the baby's new and you're fresh. Mm-hmm. And then after that period, you come out and you name the baby publicly and you show the baby to other people, and other people awash it in duty and responsibility and culture. Like it was a tradition to sort of whisper to the baby the secrets of things.
Exactly.
When old people died, when they were getting close to their death, they would tell people their secrets, their dying sort of like wisdom. And it wasn't secrets, it was like small wisdoms basically of like someone has to carry this, right? Let me give it to you.
Yeah.
And so the point of religion is very like to me was very much like those three things. Like you still have to have something anchoring the key moments of life: the birth, the marriage, the death.
Exactly. Yeah, I spent a lot of time with old folks when I was a baby. Well, young toddler. I was a talking child apparently, because my mom worked for a senior high rise here in Atlanta.
What did they say about religion?
Well, yeah, I guess what they sort of conveyed about religion is like everyone has religion. Like going to church doesn't like make God not with you or something. Like it has a need for like different people, but like the point of like being around other people was to be in community with other people, which was really interesting upon learning as an adult. You know, we all say Christian, 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 Christian in the South because it's the South. But when you look at the Pew Research Center, which is the main demographic research institution in the U.S., we actually have a number of religious categories for the U.S.: Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Black Church, and then several others that are much smaller in numbers. But Black Church is a distinct category from Protestant. I believe they call it historically Black churches or something similar.
And it's not like they're trying to exclude them when they're doing demographics research. It's not like trying to be exclusionary. It's that if they're doing denomination research, their research will literally be rendered meaningless if they include the Black/African American denominations that are technically the same religion, but have more similar practices with each other than with the white or other counterparts of their literal denomination.
Exactly. And I really experienced that really strongly growing up, because my parents were they were very vaguely like, we believe in God. If God's talking, you listen, in terms of religion, but there really wasn't any like particular larger structure we were super adhering to. We attended a United Methodist church, but my dad like also carried a Quran in the back of his car for like 15 years. So many facets. A lot of my takeaway from church was very vibes, and like, very much not like church going is not something that is inherent to your position with God. It's something that serves a need for a lot of people, but like different people have different needs spiritually, and like going to church is like kind of was very separate from like your relationship with God is like if you meet with God some other way, then like that's your way.
It's like almost irrelevant, right? It's almost kind of irrelevant what your personal, which sounds weird to be like a Quaker thing, but it's more about the public place is not a place to interrogate individual beliefs, because the fact that you're showing up as an individual means you believe enough already in the community construction, right?
Exactly.
How the community organizes itself, you believe in that, so you show up, right? You might have really strong theological differences with your neighbor and your church neighbor, but the fact that you're both still showing up to church is the basic foundation of your relationship.
Exactly. And that was like really, I think, what I took away like as a growing up young person and now an adult looking back from like all of the sum total of my religious and social experiences. And that's really like what like being a Quaker most aligns with me.
Well, and I think there's also, for me as a Catholic, there's also an idea that like and as a Mexican person who is religious, there's because also there's other religions in Mexico that aren't Catholicism. It's just overwhelmingly Catholic. But even those other religions, like the people themselves can't differentiate. My mom's friends and stuff will join new churches because their friends are, or it's like a fad, or it's like they've got better stuff. And oftentimes they won't be literally Catholic, but to them they're like, of course I'm still Catholic, because Catholic means religious to them. Catholic means the Christian that your mom is talking about. It doesn't mean a way to exclude. It means I have a religious identity.
Exactly. It means I was introduced to God and everybody when I was born. Weren't what isn't like everybody.
And there's also, it's also part of the point is also to make a space for like children and adolescents and like young people or people who've been traumatized who don't want to say that you're right about God, but also you want them to be able to go to a place that is peaceful.
Exactly.
And attend a marriage or a party for a baby, right?
And be cared for spiritually, even if like, the spiritual care they need is not something specific. Okay, yeah, well, we need to like, link up with the community to get you the help you need.
Well, and also like you and I both, when we were trying to get married, we really thought we would be successful in finding a meeting to take our marriage under their care. We really had so much faith in the Quakers because we'd felt so welcomed in Quaker meetings and we'd felt so strongly a friend identity that we were like, well, obviously in our home communities, no one would deny a random couple marriage because like that's your job as a church, is one of your three big jobs is to marry people.
Exactly.
So to deny the marriage is because A, they're gay and you don't marry gay people, or B, they're interracial and you don't approve of interracial marriage. There's really no other reason for you to not marry, or like, you know, they're in an illegal relationship, right? That's the reason not to marry
exactly
them.
Like what are churches
but other
for?
than those things, there's no reason you wouldn't marry someone, which is why we were like extra disappointed when not a single one of the Quaker meetings we asked in New York not only would marry us, but like even seemed to think that that was part of their job.
Yeah, because we asked like the actual meeting we attended at, and like they were even like, well, you know, you don't even have to get married here.
Yeah, almost every single elder, and like elder both in terms of like they were taking on some sort of like leadership spiritual role, and also that they were older than us and like an eldership age. Almost every elder that like spoke to us that was friendly and trying to help us, they all were like, are you sure, are you sure, are you sure? You don't have to, you don't have to, you don't have to, you don't have to. Why would you want to? Why would you want to? Why do you want to? And it wasn't in a like clearness kind of way, like make sure you really want to do it. It was in a, why would you want to do this? And they themselves were married in the Quaker church, right? Like they had marriage committees. It's like, why would you want a marriage committee? They're just all up in your business. And I'm like, I don't think that's what the leader of the Quaker church is supposed to be saying right now.
Exactly.
But that was overwhelmingly our experience, is that the Quakers we asked for help in marrying didn't feel like that was their job, weren't encouraging, didn't really seem like they thought that marriage was redeeming.
Yeah. They just like was not their problem, not their business, not anything that anyone needed to like be attending to. Second meeting we asked after the meeting we attended at just ghosted us.
Yes. We had one clearance committee, and then they ignored our requests, our supposed routine sort of just scheduling requests for the second one. And eventually enough time happened that we were like, oh, it's clearly not happening. Being ignored is a message.
Exactly. Then we asked the second meeting, was like the main meeting in Manhattan, and
they ignored us for almost a month.
3 months.
3 months?
We had to get someone with more clout than us to email someone else to get someone to reply to us. Just for them to be like, you guys aren't members.
No, and when someone else, it was Emily Provence. She was like, what's up with this? Because we sent a follow-up email, and she was like, guys, just a very quick email referencing us to like the proper people and being like, guys, someone please attend to this. And 3 different people emailed us with 3 different reasons why they couldn't. Like, these people are clearly not coordinating. Some of them repeated the same stuff. Some of them were nicer. Some of them were more, I don't want to say cruel, but curt. But all of them were like, nah, you ain't from us. Nah, we don't care about you. Nah.
It's basically like a bunch of, like, you can't sit with us.
Yes, it was very big, you can't sit with us energy. Oh, you can sit at the edge of the chair right here and we'll give you a seat, but you can't come closer than 3 feet. Like, that very much was like one of the 3 responses, the vibe of it.
Exactly. And thinking about what is a meeting for, what do we want, need, spiritually, emotionally, whatever, out of a meeting, I think it really comes down to friendship, capital F, friendship, in being in community with other friends. And by that, I mean,
Yeah, you can't be a friend without another person to be friends with.
exactly. Like, you, because being convinced is in like a very individual act. Well, like individual, being convinced is an individual experience, but like friendship is the next step after that, where you are in community with other people who have also been convinced that there is like a oneness or spirit that we are all led to, and that
That
we can
there's
access.
that there's an intrinsic ability within every person to the stuff of religiosity.
Exactly.
Not religiosity, but like the stuff that makes religion religion, the stuff that makes something transcendent or holy or spiritual or part of the unseen. That is, we all kind of like get it. It's big, it's good, it's the light.
Exactly. And the convincement is like, we all recognize the light, we recognize the singularity, but being in friendship is about getting there with other people.
When also like what the fact that everyone can have a relationship directly with God has to do with how we're in community, has to do with how we plan our meetings, with how we do our leadership, with how we have a wedding or don't, with how we welcome babies or children or don't, how we attend to the grieving or the nearly dying or the dead or don't.
Or yeah, how we take care of each other, how we treat our neighbors or don't treat them, or whether it's okay to kill your neighbor, which is something we don't always agree on.
Join us next time on The Quaker Stitch.